It's 1 o'clock and time for lunch. Pom-de-dum-de-dum. When the sun beats down and I lie on the bench, I can always hear them talk.
It's summer 1973. English music is enjoying a commercial success in America not seen since the days of Beatlemania. A whole host of bands are now exporting a new, sophisticated type of music, one that introduced elements of European classicism, whimsical folk, and medieval mythology to the American shores. This was music that tapped into our own shared heritage, and the more intellectual, eccentric, and technically complex it was, the better it was received. This was very much the mindset that Genesis adopted over the summer of that year as they wrote their next album. The Foxtrot Tour had saw the band play some small shows in America, and as a result, the band decided that their next album should be aimed directly at this fresh and lucrative market, not by setting it in that country, as the Lamb would later do, but by drawing upon their own and exporting it by the pound. That's a reference to a measurement of weight, by the way, and not our currency. The next album was to mine all things English, our humour, our sadness, our loves, and our legends. Since June, the band had been based in Chessington, in Surrey, an area steeped in history. It features in our Doomsday Book of 1068. It had links with Henry VIII and witnessed the horrors of the Civil War. One can't help think that some of this historical energy rubbed off on the band during their stay. The band's abode was an old stately home called Bamwell Court, which was then owned by the bass player John Giblin, known to Phil Collins and later to play with him in Brand X. Despite this inspirational backdrop, the band has since reported having difficulties in writing the material there. To relieve the boredom of the writing sessions, the ever-restless Collins formed a small jazz rock side band, a forerunner for Brand X, called Vox and the Radar Boys. It featured ex-Yes guitarist Peter Banks, and they played a few gigs around that summer. Both Hackett and Collins have made reference to listening to the band Mahavishnu Orchestra at this time, and certainly the latter part of Moonlit Night echoes a lot of that kind of frenetic jazz rock sound. As opposed to arriving with completed songs, the band commenced the writing sessions with pieces of songs that were then jammed and developed. It was a style of writing that they would employ again with the Lamb before abandoning it somewhat until the Duke album. Banks and Rutherford's recollections of the rehearsals are less than rosy. They both recall a lot of time being wasted with endless jamming and reworking of pieces. It was this constant layering and revisiting of ideas that led to the elongation of pieces like Battle of Epping Forest. Demo recordings from the time suggest that this piece was even longer, with what appears to be a kind of battle sequence once sandwiched into it. Gabriel's concerns during the writing phase was that too much time was being devoted to lengthy instrumental passages of music. But despite all these tensions, the band ended up with more than enough material for an album and reconvened at Island's Basing Street Studios to record it. Much has been said about how the album's title and lyrics were influenced by the political backdrop of the time. This was one of strikes, rising taxes and inflation, and heated debate over our country's membership of the European Union. There was an unease in the air, with the very essence of the country seemingly under threat. At this time, the political Labour Party were against Britain's economic union with Europe, and it's been often said by various band members that the title Selling England by the Pound came from a Labour Party manifesto published around this time. In an attempt to verify this claim, I visited the archive library of this political party, but couldn't find a reference to this line anywhere. There wasn't a manifesto published in 1973, and it isn't featured in any of their yearly booklets nor their weekly newsletters. Furthermore, I doubt that a political party would have made reference explicitly to England when they were trying to govern the whole of the United Kingdom. Maybe the phrase could be an allusion to the late 60s Prime Minister Harold Wilson when he gave a speech about the diminishing pound in your pocket. He, by the way, is the Mr. Wilson referred to in the Beatles' Taxman song. To further cast doubt on this legend, the source of the title isn't referenced in contemporary interviews, even when asked explicitly where does the title come from. Therefore, on reflection, I think this could be a classic case of a distant memory and a Gabriel story becoming layered upon by different writers until it becomes perceived fact. It's something that I admit I'm slightly guilty of when making these videos. To design the cover, the band approached the London artist Betty Swanwick. Her work was often used on London transport and attraction designs, and at the Royal Academy exhibition that summer, some of her paintings were displayed to visitors, one of whom was Peter Gabriel. He contacted Swanwick and asked her if she could create something in this style, but with more specific references to the album's lyrics. Owing to time constraints, and the album's release date, and the fact that it took her several months to create these paintings, she said she couldn't create a brand new piece from scratch. She did, however, offer to adapt one of her paintings, titled The Dream, with the addition of the lawnmower from the song I Know What I Like. The cover's clean border and no-nonsense sans serif font reflected a maturing band, and one that was starting to distance itself slightly from the rather amateurish feeling of the Foxtrot cover. Let's now peel back the layers of this album and uncover the influences behind the tracks.
Citizens of hope and glory, time goes by, it's the time of your life.
Our album opens with an a cappella vocal from Gabriel, sung as a medieval plainsong ballad, and one that echoes the album title's sense of lament. In what was now becoming almost a Genesis style, the track gathers momentum as it tells its story, moving through heavy rock, freeform jazz to pastoral ambience. The end section was originally called Disney, and it was originally planned to allow the song to merge seamlessly into Cinema Show, and then back to a reprise in the form of Isle of Plenty. Like the rest of the album, the track brilliantly demonstrates Gabriel's magpie-like capacity for taking references from a rich variety of sources. He plays this part like a kind of medieval minstrel, and he allows the story to unfold through his typical wordplay. The changing nature of shopping, commerce, and the marketplace in general is what weaves this track and most of the album together.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card, she plays for tune. The deck is uneven right from the start.
We have here a whole host of references to English life and literature. The lyrics evoke a loss and a yearning, and the emergence of supermarkets, decimalisation, and fast food chains, with the singer's wimpy dreams being conjured up by the UK's first burger chain. This is where Peter first met his future wife Jill.
You play the hobby horse, I play the fool. We'll tease the bull rigging, round and loud, loud and round.
The knights themselves contemplate Old England's demise while sat at King Arthur's round table. Their green shields refer to an early form of supermarket loyalty scheme. These were stamps that were collected with each purchase for future discounts. The knight's cry of paper late was a phrase that was used by the band to test microphone sound levels during sound checks, and of course it was recycled in their 1982 hit of the same name. It could be a play on words for a phrase that was shouted by Victorian newspaper boys when selling their late papers. The reference to a uniform is a classic Gabriel play on words. It's a mixture of the mythical faun and unicorn, whilst Old Father Thames refers to our equivalent of the Roman god of the sea, Neptune. The Land of Hope and Glory is second to God Save the Queen as probably our most symbolic national anthem. While the Queen of the May, the Fool, and the Hobby Horse all feature in our springtime May Day festivals, which are still celebrated today in a lot of rural communities. To crown it all, Gabriel dressed as Britannia when performing the song. This is of course one of our many national symbols, most of which have disappeared from public use and importance. In this sense, Gabriel really did see our future. The track is a perfect curtain raiser, and along with some simply phenomenal playing, includes perhaps Gabriel's greatest ever set of lyrics. Like the previous track, this song is a true group composition, but with Gabriel lyrics. The main riff was coined by Steve Hackett, and he doodled around with it since the Foxtrot sessions.
Sunday night, Mr. Farmer called, said, "Listen, son, you're wasting time. There's a future for you in the fire escape trade. Come up."
The final track is a sort of beatless sing-along, and it provides some light relief from an album that is dominated by multi-segmented epics. The song became the band's first UK hit single, despite it being released some 4 months after the album came out. The band had a ready-made promo video waiting for this, which was a live performance shot at Shepperton Studios. However, it was premiered on the Top of the Pops TV show by a group of dancers acting the song out.
Stepping one beyond your show.
The lyric sheet included on the album's release states that the lyrics are based on the cover painting The Dream, but it isn't clear who Jacob actually is. One theory is that he's the character from Jacob's Ladder. This is a biblical story, and the idea is that Jacob dreams of a ladder that allows him to climb to heaven, and it's been thought that the striped lawn on the cover may represent this ladder. An alternative suggestion is that it was named after someone called Jacob Finster, who was apparently a roadie for the band. This Jacob was something of a lazy layabout, and famed for never being able to hold a job down. This Jacob eventually died of a heroin overdose. The wardrobe itself is thought to come from the novel The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, whilst the Garden Wall is the first name that some of the band members played under. Both Hackett and Gabriel reference that they become very tired of playing the song. It's ironic as it's become probably the track that the band have played live more than any other. It originally had a small keyboard part that was played by Gabriel at the very end, but it was never used in the final mix.
The path is clear, though no eyes can see. The course laid down long before.
With music and most of the lyrics written exclusively by Banks, this haunting elegy combines pieces of music that he had left over from the Foxtrot sessions. It's arguably the band's best constructed song ever, and this is without doubt the jewel in this album's crown.
Na 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 na.
Banks's regal-like piano is perfectly complemented by Gabriel's haunting flute. And whilst incorporating the then new Pro Soloist synthesizer, it manages to sustain a grand and historical feeling throughout it. The lyrics, which have been later dismissed by Banks as some of the worst he's ever created, centre around nautical mythology. The Undinal, meaning water-related songs, are those sung by similar aquatic temptresses that lurked in the fountain of Salmacis. Banks has frequently referenced the poet T.S. Eliot as an influence on the song, and certainly his poem Death by Water has similarities. A firth, of course, is the Scottish name for an estuary of water. There's one belonging to the River Forth, the Firth of Forth, and hence the somewhat cheesy pun to this title. Banks's piano introduction is a pure delight, but he had a lot of difficulty recreating it live. There's a belief that after one particularly bad rendition of this intro, that it was abandoned, but this isn't true. He did play it in its entirety until the end of the tour, even after this howler. The much-loved climax to this piece features without doubt what is Steve Hackett's finest moment with the band, and it stakes a claim to being one of the best bits of music that this band ever made.
Not knowing which way to turn.
After his previous exploits, Tony Banks is completely absent from this track. This modest offering was written by Phil and Mike on the steps of the Island Studios, very late in the recording sessions. It was producer John Burns who pressed for this track's inclusion on the album, arguing that it would give it some balance. I personally feel, however, that side 1 already had a perfect ending with Fur for Fifth, and also considering the incredible 53 minutes length of the album, and the way that the length compromises the tonal qualities of physical vinyl, it's hard to understand why this track was included. The song is similar to pieces that Phil and Mike were recording with Anthony Phillips around this time, with Phil's voice sounding a pale whimper compared to the dramatic heights he would scale with similar ballads in the near future. Phil didn't meet his first fateful wife until the actual Selling England tour, so unfortunately, this lyric refers to yet another of his failed relationships that didn't work out alright.
Yes, I'm sure it will work out alright. Coming over the hill, the boys of Bill and Johnny's lads stand very still. And Harold Demure from our literature nips up the nearest tree. Here come the cavalry.
Within this ancient piece of woodland, there are many ghosts from the past. It was used as a hunting ground for Henry VIII in the 1500s. It was the setting of witch trials and hangings in the 1600s, and was used by a hideout for the highwayman Dick Turpin in the 1700s. During the 1800s, it was a setting for many historical riots and local unrest over taxation and field enclosures and the like. And by April 1972, it was the site of a real-life battle between two rival London gangs. And like Moonlit Night, the bulk of this song was developed by the band together in the early writing sessions. Gabriel, however, provides all the lyrics, and we really get our money's worth.
It all began when I went on a tour hoping to find some furniture. Followed a sign saying beautiful chest, led to a lady who showed me her best. She was taken by surprise when I quickly closed my eyes. So she rang the bell and quick as hell Bob Van came out on his job to see what the trouble was.
The song's inspiration comes from an article in the Times newspaper about rival gangs meeting in the forest to settle a kind of turf war for control over London's East End. The article reports shotguns, axes and swords being confiscated from raids on homes after the battle. Gabriel fleshes out the song with a wonderful array of characters, and like Moonlit Night, there's an onslaught of references throughout this track, far too many to pick up individually here. I often wonder how songs like this have come across to non-English listeners, in the sense that we're more accustomed to the stories of Robin Hood and Little John, and King Charles nipping up the nearest tree. So I can only imagine just how these otherworldly lyrics really come across. I suppose that's part of their charm, and in terms of capturing the rich and historical depth that our country has to offer, this song does it better than anything.
So telling me!
The place names are all from London's East End and Essex. At that time, it was considered one of the more unsavoury parts of our capital. Forest Road is the main road out of London that leads towards the forest. And very near to the area is Bethnal Green and Barking, where the butchers and slugs respectively lurk. It's all a million miles from Charterhouse, and I don't think Peter would last 5 minutes if he met the real Willie Wright, Mick the Prick or Bob the Knob. He does, however, bring them to life wonderfully with some fantastic Python-esque vocal characterizations.
Shoot! To save my steeple, I visited people, for this I'd gone when I met Little John. His name came, I understood, when the judge said, "You are a Robin Hood."
The song divides fans, with some citing it as being the worst on the album, and it's frequently referenced by the band as being a classic example of Gabriel's tendency to flood a song with just too many words. Certainly the band's incredible playing is lost with the sheer barrage of words that are thrown over it. The aftermath of the battle is this pleasant Steve Hackett instrumental, one that evokes themes of Tudor England, patriotism, and a yearning for one's distant homeland. This track was openly disliked by Banks and Gabriel, who didn't want to include it on the album. Arguments over this track saw the seeds being sown for Hackett ultimately leaving the band. The original demos for the song reveal a much faster arrangement without any piano, and this is probably where Banks developed his dislike for the number. In reality, he plays some lovely piano over the final version. The latter guitar section was actually written by Mike Rutherford, and it's not that dissimilar to the Shadow of the Hierophant that both he and Steve collaborated on. Sandwiched between the onslaughts of Epping Forest and the epic cinema show, this is something of a forgotten song, and one which perfectly complements the medieval tone of the album perfectly.
Home from work, our Juliet clears her morning meal. She dabs her skin with pretty smells concealing to appeal. I will make my bed, she said, good turn to go. Can she be late for her cinema show? Cinema show.
Another career highlight for the band, this epic opens with a beautiful Mike Rutherford guitar sequence in which Gabriel tells a modern day take on Romeo and Juliet. It was Gabriel's idea to use the names of the Shakespeare characters, but the rest of the lyrics themselves were penned by Mike and Tony. Unlike the Firth of Fifth, it was inspired very much by the T.S. Eliot poem The Wasteland. Part of this poem centres upon two young lovers preparing for a date at the end of a workday, and the young man's expectations of it. The lover's tale is told through the eyes of the Greek legend is told by the eyes of the Greek legend Tiresias, a figure who changed from a man into a woman and then back again, so we could perceive the feelings of both. It's from this idea that we get the lines, "Want a man like the sea I raged, and want a woman like the earth I gave." Tiresias concluded that it's ultimately women who want more out of sex and relationships than men, and in this way there seems to be more earth than sea. Certainly there is a lot of similarity with the lines from this poem and the final lyrics here. The song weaves in and out of numerous tempo changes and finally arrives at a wonderful extended jam piece played by Banks, Collins and Rutherford. There's a real sense of enjoyment here, and it's as if the blueprint for future improvised tracks like Duke's Travels, Abacab and Home by the Sea were all being mapped out here. Gabriel was critical of this extended section, whilst conversely, Collins questioned the idea of the extended 12-string opening and supported the initial idea of this song being much shorter and merged into Moonlit Night. Hackett has also voiced a discontent with being left out of much of this track. But despite all these objections, the song, or sections of it, were played on almost every subsequent live tour. And it feels like Collins projects more emotion into his interpretation of the vocal than Gabriel originally did. On hearing Banks' closing synth playing, Charisma Records apparently feared that the band were going to turn into ELP. And aside from this innovative end section, the song doesn't really break any new ground and is really just a retelling of Musical Box and Supper's Ready. But then that isn't such a bad thing.
I don't belong here, said old Tessa out loud. Easy love, There's the safe way home, thankful for her fine fair discount. Tess cooperates. Still alone in oh hello, see the deadly nightshade grow.
This closing coda to the album is often thought to be a part of the cinema show. It was developed by Hackett and Gabriel, and it cleverly wraps up the musical themes that the album opened with, and also presents more imagery about the growing commercialisation of English culture. Safeway, Fine Fare, Tesco and the Cooperative are all names of English supermarkets that were starting to appear on our high streets in the early 1970s. Their names are sung in the round along with other random food products and prices spiralling away to the album's close. Despite its mere 90 seconds in running time, this song brings a brilliant symmetry to the album, and it neatly rounds off what for many is the golden era of the band. Certainly Selling England seems to belong more to its preceding albums than the band's next one. Two tracks that didn't make it onto the final album were Mike's Compression and Deja Vu, written by Peter and Steve. Compression ultimately ended up as a B-side to Mike's Small Creeps Day single, Working in Line. It was recorded during the Selling England sessions, with Mike playing the doom-laden arpeggios on an electric sitar. One can imagine this segment being used as a closing sequence to a track, perhaps Dancing with the Moonlit Night. The track Deja Vu was apparently started by Peter during this period and subsequently finished off by Steve many years later as part of his 1996 Genesis Revisited album. However, the arrangement presented by Hackett sounds nothing like the recordings from that era, and to date the track hasn't surfaced on any demo tapes. I doubt therefore that this track ever really was from that era, and it's a shame that it wasn't presented in a style more fitting the 1973 album. Finally released in October, the album charted at a new high of number 3 in the UK, and also introduced the band to the US charts with a number 70 placing. It also saw the single I Know What I Like reach 21 in the UK charts. Reviews at the time were generally positive, with a general feeling that the band had finally perfected a sound that they'd spent many years building towards. The promotional tour started in Paris 2 months before the album's release, with the stage incorporating a new look, with hourglass-style shapes replacing the white sheet. The original idea was to have an inflatable stage set, with images projected onto these inflatables, but this idea was scrapped due to fire regulations that were brought out just at this time. The tour's set list remained pretty constant throughout, with almost all of the new album being played. Watch of the Skies and Supper's Ready were retained from Foxtrot, and Musical Box and a very occasional Harold the Barrel were played from Nursery Crime. The Knife also appeared on some gigs, and it's on this tour that Peter performed the Musical Box as Old Henry, as opposed to wearing the fox's head. In the last few months of the tour, the band altered the stage set, replacing the white shapes with a plain black curtain, and painting some of the equipment black. They also introduced a slideshow in what would be a forerunner for the lamp, and put more emphasis into coloured dramatic lighting. The two periods are subsequently known as the White and Black Tours, respectively. The latter shows have more venom and energy to the band's playing, and reveal a band with a loyal and now global fan base. Genesis were now having more chart success with each release, and were becoming the toast of the music press. Selling England regularly tops fan polls as their greatest. Although several albums have a valid claim to this position, it may just edge the others out. Perhaps its greatest accolade comes from an exiled Englishman, one who was living a new life in New York and yet still reminisced about his homeland. Selling England was an album that this person supposedly listened to. That person is none other than John Lennon. Steve Hackett has made frequent, albeit changing references to an interview that Lennon made around this time, claiming that Lennon loved the Selling England album. Hackett's account is that the band were in New York, just about to fly out to Los Angeles, when an elated Gabriel told him that he had just heard John Lennon giving an interview on the radio saying that Genesis were one of the bands he was listening to. I have my doubts. Firstly, tour listings reveal that the band never played in LA immediately after New York, and furthermore, there's no record of this Lennon quote anywhere, and all of his interviews from this period have been transcribed. To further cast doubt on this tale, one has to consider that Lennon was largely listening to old rock and roll around this time, and further immersing himself into American culture. He had no real love of classical music, and openly disliked the overblown and segmented nature of Abbey Road Side 2. It's therefore hard to imagine him even encountering the Selling England album, let alone listening to it and liking it enough to reference in one of his rare interviews. As a huge Beatles fan, I very much want this tale to be true, but I just can't see it. And I think it's yet another example of Court Jester Gabriel's mischief making. But as this album shows, he's a master storyteller, and he kept his heart in New York to tell his next. And so this story ends, the story of how Genesis sold England by the pound.
Well, he free and saw this from